All right. Running a minute or two behind. Had to find my Bible. So, I set it down and then I thought it was in my bag. Anyway. John chapter 2. John chapter 2. It says, "On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.' His mother said to the servants, 'Whatever he says to you, do it.' Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, 'Fill the water pots with water.' And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, 'Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast.' And they took it. And when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, 'Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have all well drunk, then the inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now.' This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. After this he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days." So, right off the bat, we see there at Cana of Galilee, and so there's a Cana up in that area, and it's in the area where Jesus did a lot of his traveling around the Galilee, and there's this wedding. Now, in verse 4, where he says it says woman, gunye in the Greek, it's not a derogatory term in whatever way it could ever be. It was a very proper term to use. It comes across a bit rough in the English, but it isn't. It was a very proper way for him to address his mother. But he tells her, "My hour has not yet come." Now, it's fascinating that throughout the Gospels, we see this phrase again and again and again. My hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come. And maybe we'll talk about it more when we get there. But there's a prophecy about when the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is supposed to ride in to Jerusalem on a donkey and be worshipped as Messiah and King. And Jesus knew that people were going to try and make him king. After feeding the 5,000, it says they try to take and make him king. But he gets out of the way and he disappears because he's always saying, "My hour has not yet come." The demons cry out, "We know who you are. You are the Son of God. You are the Christ." And he's like, "Hey, my hour has not yet come." And for those of us familiar with it and those who've never heard it, there is that prophecy we see where from Daniel chapter 9, 173,880 days from the command to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince would show up. And if you do your math and you figure it all out, it takes us from March, I think it was 14th of 486 BC, all the way up until April 6th of 32 AD, Palm Sunday, when Jesus rides in on the donkey. So this "my hour has not yet come" thing, it was very significant. And Jesus was just starting his early ministry, and this, turning the water into wine, was his first miracle. Now, we see what happens. He miraculously turns water into wine. I won't bore you all with information about the purification and the pots and all that stuff, but there's fascinating tradition and stuff you could understand from that. But there's this line that is spoken in verse 10. "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now. He saved the best until last." And I think that's something that is an important thing for all Christians, all believers, to understand, that God will always save the best for last. And as we go through this world, and we face trials, and although we may receive some blessings, they are truly inferior, because the greatest blessings are saved for last. The greatest healing, the greatest recoveries, the greatest of everything, it is going to be saved for last. And as we live day-to-day life, are we acting like the best is yet to come? Because that would change the way we acted. If we really believed it in our hearts in a very tangible way, that when this life is over, the best I could ever dream of is yet to come. Which means the things I'm dreaming of right now, the things that look attractive, the things that seem to draw me, can I settle it in my heart that these aren't the best? That the best is yet to come. And so I think it is something that we need to get set in our minds, that God will save the best for last. And the best is yet to come. I'm trying to keep an eye on a watch or a clock somewhere. So, verse 13, it says, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers were doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them out, all out of the temple. With the sheep, the oxen, he poured out the money changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise.' Then his disciples remembered what was written, 'Zeal for your house has eaten me up.' So the Jews answered and said to him, 'Wow, what sign do you show us since you do these things?' Jesus answered and said, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' So then the Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he answered, he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus said." Now, I'm going to read the last 3 verses, and we'll wrap up all of chapter 2 today, it looks like. "Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did, because Jesus did not commit himself to them, because he knew all men. And he did not need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man." So we'll save that for the end. So here's the deal. Jesus is going to go celebrate the Passover 3 times in his ministry. That's how we know he did it for 3 years. This is the first time. He will clean house again on the final time of Passover when he's crucified. So this takes place more than once. And this time it talks about him making a whip, and he's sitting there braiding the cords together so that he can go and clean house. Now, lately, people have talked a little bit about the protests that have been going on, and some people have pointed and said, look, even Jesus wasn't afraid to get a little wild and crazy and do these things. And, there's some truth to that. Yeah. This is probably the big extreme example of Jesus that sometimes, by sometimes I mean often, it seems like people want to look at as look, Jesus can show righteous anger and he can throw over tables and make a whip. And while that's true, firstly, man, I wish I had the discernment of being God to know when the right time to do that was. Because you know what? It would be hard for me to know, is this the time it's okay for me to make a whip and start chasing people and turning over tables? It's definitely not what I would call the overarching theme of Jesus' ministry. But it shows there is a time and a place for extreme measures and to be in your face. The second important thing is that the temple was his Father's house. Jesus wasn't going into someone else's house. It was his house. And these people had set up shop in his house and were doing things that were unlawful in his house. And that is much different than going into someone else's house and turning over tables, or going into a shop and doing bad things in a shop, as opposed to when people come and set up shop in your house. So it's a good reminder that what Jesus was doing was trying to right the wrongs within the church. It wasn't going out on the public streets. It was in his Father's house. And he was cleaning house because what they were doing was wrong. And if you aren't familiar with it, I mean, these people were using and abusing the innocent people who were coming to worship God the one way God had taught them how, to bring their sacrifices to the temple. Before Jesus, that was the way to worship God. And when they would come, they would say, oh, your lamb's not good enough. You need to buy one of our lambs. And they would sell them this super overpriced lamb. But that's not all, because you couldn't buy their lamb with your money. You had to use temple money. And so when they exchanged the temple money, they had this ridiculous exchange rate where they were ripping people off left and right. And who were the people who were in charge of all this? It was the priests. Caiaphas, Annas, the high priest, and the people who served in the temple, they had a cut over everything that was going on. And so Jesus was trying to create reform within their religious system. He wasn't out trying to do things against Rome. Jesus never really spoke out against Rome. He was trying to do work in-house, in his Father's house. And so he speaks of the prophecy of of destroying the temple. And that in 3 days he'd build it back up again. And you have to understand, this temple was magnificent. Even what's left of it, if you go to Israel, is magnificent. And they never believed it could happen. What's awesome is that we have copies of the Gospels of Matthew that predate 70 AD. So we know this was written before the temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. This prophecy is mind-blowing. No one would have ever thought they would have thrown down the temple, but because the temple was set on fire during the destruction of Jerusalem, the gold melted and it became destroyed, and so finally they said, all right, just destroy it. Because originally they didn't want to destroy it because it was such a beautiful marvel of architecture. And so Jesus did all these miracles, and he began his earthly ministry. And tomorrow we get to make it into John 3 and his famous discussion with Nicodemus, a.k.a. Nick at Night. I'll see you guys tomorrow. God bless.